Keith and Diane grew up in the exact same small rural town of London, Ohio. It was one of those places where everybody knew everybody and families had known each other for generations. They were high school sweethearts, the kind of couple you see in old yearbooks, and it just seemed natural that after high school, they would get married. And that's exactly what they did. Fast forward about 6 years, and their life seemed pretty perfect. They were still happily married, they had a beautiful 4-year-old daughter named Raven, and Diane had just found what she thought was their absolute dream home. This new house was also in London, Ohio, so they weren't leaving the town they knew and loved. But this property was different. It was much more isolated than any of the other places they had looked at. It was technically still within the town limits, but it was set way back in the forest, far off the beaten path. For some people, that might have been a downside, but for them, it was a huge selling point. Keith was an avid hunter. He loved being out in the woods. And Diane loved the peace and quiet of the forest too. They both really liked the idea of having total privacy, of being away from nosy neighbors and the sounds of the town. So they didn't hesitate. They bought the house, moved in, and started to settle into their new life. Their routine, however, was a little demanding. Keith was working incredibly hard to provide for his family. He had a full-time job as a welder during the day, which was already tough work. But on top of that, he was also taking night classes to prepare for a special apprenticeship program he was really hoping to get into. This meant that for 5 days a week, Keith was gone from the house for about 12 hours at a time. He would leave early in the morning and not get back until late at night. This left Diane at home alone with Raven a lot of the time, especially in the evenings after Raven was in bed. Diane was a stay-at-home mom, so this new, isolated house was basically her whole world during the week. In those first couple of weeks after they moved in, as Diane was getting used to the new sounds of the house and the long stretches of being alone, she started to notice something. At night, after the house was quiet, she would hear this faint sound coming from outside. She described it as a sort of scampering noise, like some animal was moving around in the brush just beyond their yard. It wasn't particularly alarming. After all, they lived in the middle of a forest. Animals were to be expected. She had this big, beautiful window right over the kitchen sink. Whenever she was washing dishes, she was looking directly out into the dense woods that made up their backyard. So, from time to time, when she'd hear that scampering, she'd lean in and poke her head closer to the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. She just figured it was a deer or maybe a stray dog from a neighboring farm. It was just a little quirk of their new property, nothing to be concerned about. It was just something she noticed. One night, Keith was out late for his night school class, and Diane had just put Raven to bed. She went downstairs to clean up the kitchen and the living room. As she was standing at the sink, washing the last of the dinner dishes, she heard that familiar scampering sound again. It seemed a little closer this time. She leaned toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The problem was, the light from the kitchen was on behind her, which created a really strong glare on the glass. So to see anything at all, she had to press her face right up close to the window pane, cupping her hands around her eyes to block out the reflection. She stared out toward the tree line, which was only about 20 or 25 feet from the back of the house. It was very close. And as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it. A pair of eyes, reflecting the light from the house, staring right back at her. Her first thought was a little bit of relief. She thought, okay, it's a dog. That confirms it. There's a loose dog that's been wandering around the property. That's what has been making all that noise. She wasn't scared. She grew up in the country. She was used to animals. So she just thought, cool, it's a dog, and finished up with the dishes. She then walked into the living room, which was on the other side of the house. The windows in the living room looked out in the opposite direction from the kitchen window. She was just tidying up, picking up Raven's toys and putting things away. As she moved around the room, she happened to glance up towards one of the living room windows, and her heart just stopped. For just a split second, she saw another set of eyes. But these were different. They were at human height, and they were pressed right up against the glass, looking in. She only saw the reflection for a moment before she instinctively backed away, totally startled. The lights were on in the living room, so again, it was hard to see outside clearly. She started to doubt herself immediately. Did I really see that? Or am I just scaring myself because I'm alone out here? Her mind started racing. She tried to rationalize it. She went back into the kitchen, thinking she'd look out that window again. She was hoping to see the dog's eyes again, maybe further away. She thought if the dog was still there, it would somehow explain what she just saw in the living room, even though that wouldn't make any sense. A dog couldn't be that tall. She walked into the kitchen and slowly approached the window over the sink. She was leaning in, her head getting closer and closer to the glass, trying to see past the glare. And just as her forehead was about to touch the window, a face appeared. It came right up in front of her on the other side of the glass. It was a person's head with these glowing golden eyes looking directly at her. She was so horrified she stumbled backward and fell to the floor. She was on the ground, looking up, and this face was still there in the window, just staring in at her. She started scrambling backward on the floor, trying to get out of the kitchen and out of its line of sight. And at that exact moment, she heard the sound of car tires on their gravel driveway. It was Keith. Her first thought was a rush of panic. Oh my God, Keith is going to run into whoever is outside. She heard the car door open and shut, and then she heard Keith call out her name. She prayed it was really him. A moment later, he walked in and saw her on the floor of the living room, looking terrified. He immediately ran over to her, asking what was going on, what had happened. She tried to explain it through her panic. She told him she saw someone outside, that she thought it was a dog at first, but it wasn't. It was a person staring in the window. Keith listened, but he was skeptical. He's a hunter, he knows the woods. He knows they just moved into this isolated house. His immediate thought was that his wife was just a little scared of being so far out in the country by herself. He figured her imagination was probably getting the best of her. To calm her down, he grabbed a big flashlight and went outside. He walked the entire perimeter of the property. He shined the light into the tree line. He looked all around the house, under the windows, everywhere. He couldn't find a single footprint. He couldn't see any sign that anyone had been there at all. He came back inside and tried to reassure her. He told her he knew they had just moved in and that she was probably stressed being there alone so often with a huge forest right outside their door. He said she was going to hear animals and see things in the dark and that she shouldn't sweat it. It was probably nothing to worry about. But Diane was not okay with being told not to worry about it. She knew what she saw. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't her imagination. About a month went by after that incident. Keith and Diane had stopped talking about it. There hadn't been any more strange occurrences at the house. Diane hadn't seen any more eyes in the windows. She hadn't heard any more scampering sounds. Life had kind of gone back to normal. Keith was still working long hours and going to night school. One evening, he was gone, and Diane was home by herself again. She was in the kitchen and found herself subconsciously looking out that same window over the sink. This time, she didn't hear any scampering or anything to warn her. Without any warning at all, she saw a set of eyes just suddenly appear at the edge of the window right where the woods began. She saw them dead on, and this time there was no doubt. She immediately backed away from the window, her mind racing. Her first and only thought was that she had to protect Raven, who was asleep upstairs. Her next thought was a tactical one: turn off all the lights in the house. If the house was dark, the person outside couldn't see in. So, terrified but determined, she ran through the downstairs of the house, flipping off every single light switch. The last light she had to turn off was in the living room. She stood with her back pressed against the wall, her hand on the switch. As she hit the switch and plunged the living room into darkness, her eyes adjusted. And because it was now dark inside, she could see outside with perfect clarity. And what she saw made her blood run cold. Standing there, with its body pressed right up against the living room window, was a human figure. It had those same orange glowing eyes at eye level, and it was looking directly into the room right where she had been standing just seconds before. She was horrified. She started sliding along the wall, trying to make her way back into the kitchen without making a sound. They had a landline phone mounted on the wall in the kitchen, and she knew she had to get to it. As she moved, she tried to keep an eye on the figure at the back window. From her angle, she could just see the silhouette of its shoulder. She finally reached the phone, fumbled with the receiver, and called 911. She whispered to the operator that there was someone outside her house, and they wouldn't go away. As soon as she hung up the phone, she watched as the silhouette of the shoulder disappeared from her view. She peeked her head back around the corner into the living room, and the figure was gone. The yard was empty. The house was completely silent for a moment. And then she heard it. She heard clear, heavy scampering sounds, like someone running, circling the entire house. She could hear it move from the back, to the side, to the front, and then around the other side. She just stood there, in the dark, frozen, wondering if it was going to try to break a window and get inside. She had no idea what she would do if it did. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police car pulling into her driveway. She heard a firm knock at the door. She ran to it, unlocked it, and opened it to find 2 police officers standing on her porch. She was hysterical, trying to explain what had happened. The police tried to calm her down so they could get a clear story. She was pointing out into the darkness, telling them there was something out there. The police started sweeping the property with their flashlights, just like Keith had done a month before. A few minutes later, Keith's car pulled into the driveway. He saw the police cars and immediately knew what had happened. He just thought, she saw that thing again. He was convinced it was probably just her own reflection in the glass, and now she had called the police. This was a small town. He was worried that people were going to start thinking he and his wife were crazy. He walked into the house, and he later said he really regretted his reaction, but he immediately got angry with Diane. He said things like, "What are you doing? You're calling the cops? There's nothing out here. I looked last time, they're looking now. The police officers were even telling her that they hadn't seen anything. They said they'd look for a little bit longer, but there was no sign of anyone being on the property." Eventually, the police came back to the door and confirmed that they hadn't found anything at all. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing. They told Diane to call them if anything else happened, and then they left. Keith and Diane were left alone in the house, and they just had a huge fight. He didn't believe her, and she was terrified and felt completely alone. 4 more months went by without any incidents. There was no more scampering, no more eyes in the windows. Keith and Diane had sort of moved past the whole ordeal. They weren't really thinking about it anymore. Diane even admitted later that she had started to believe that maybe it was all in her imagination. She thought maybe she was just stressed and overwhelmed by how much she was alone in that big, isolated house, and her mind was playing tricks on her. So, 4 months pass, and it's now early December of 1981. One morning, the region got its first big snowfall of the winter. A few inches of fresh, white powder covered everything. Keith woke up early while Diane and Raven were still sleeping. He decided he would go out and get donuts and coffee for the family as a nice surprise. It was still dark outside when he left the house. He got into his car, started it up to let it warm, and sat there for a moment, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached up to adjust his rearview mirror, and as he moved it, he stopped. For just a split second, he thought he saw someone standing behind his car. He blinked and looked again, readjusting the mirror. But the figure was gone. He thought, What was that? He threw the car in park, grabbed the powerful flashlight he kept in the glove compartment, and got out. He knew he had just seen someone standing right there. He started walking around his car, shining the light everywhere. And as he was looking, he realized the irony of the situation. Here he was, doing the exact same thing his wife had done, believing he saw somebody outside their house and now searching for them in the dark. He couldn't find anyone. But then he remembered what had convinced him his wife was imagining things, the lack of footprints. But this time, there was fresh snow. And as he shined his light across the ground, he saw them. Tracks. He couldn't quite tell what kind of tracks they were at first, but there were clear prints in the untouched snow. He knew exactly where he had walked, and these weren't his. He started following them, thinking they would lead him to a person or maybe an animal he didn't know. The tracks led from behind his car right up to the side of his house. And then they just stopped. He stood there, confused, shining his light on the last set of prints. He thought, where could they have gone? And then he looked up. There was a section of their house on the first floor that was a little extended, which meant there was a low roof over that part of the building. And he saw that the footsteps went from the ground up onto that first floor roof. Then they continued up to the second floor roof and went over to the other side of the house. He was just stunned. Who does that? What kind of person climbs onto someone's roof in the middle of the night? He walked around to the other side of the house looking for more prints on the ground, but he couldn't see any. He was just staring up at the top of his house thinking, am I going crazy? There's something on my roof. What is going on? At that moment, he finally believed his wife. He ran inside and immediately called his hunting buddy Dennis. Dennis was the only person who lived relatively close to them. Keith told him, you have to come over here right now. I've got something really weird going on. I think someone is stalking my house. I can't be sure, but you've got to come over. Dennis didn't hesitate. He said he'd be there in a minute. When Dennis pulled into the driveway, Keith was already outside waiting for him, holding his hunting rifle. Dennis got out of his truck and asked what in the world was going on. Keith quickly explained and showed him the prints. He pointed up at the roof and said, someone jumped onto my roof. Someone is on my roof. I don't know what's happening, but I think someone is up there. As they were standing there talking about it, they both heard a loud thump. It was the sound of something heavy landing on the ground from a pretty high distance, and it came from the other side of the house. They both ran around the house, rifles ready, and when they got to the other side, they saw two clear footprints in the snow. But they were about 20 feet away from the edge of the house. This meant that whatever was on the roof had not only jumped down 2 stories to the ground, but it had also jumped 20 feet out, away from the house, in a single leap. There were no other footprints between the house and where these 2 prints were. They had just heard it land, and then it must have run off into the forest. Dennis and Keith just looked at each other, completely baffled. Dennis asked, what do you want to do? Keith replied, let's go after it. Now, these 2 men were experienced hunters. They knew these woods like the back of their hands. They immediately started following the tracks into the forest. And right away, they noticed 2 very strange things about the footprints. First, they were huge. They measured them later, and they were about 14 inches long. Second, it appeared to be a bipedal creature. The tracks were from something moving on 2 legs, not 4. They were trying to wrap their heads around it. What kind of person would be able to get on the roof like that and jump that far? And what kind of animal runs around on 2 legs and has a 14-inch track? They had no idea what to make of it. Was it a person? Was it some kind of creature? They didn't know. So they just kept following the tracks deeper and deeper into the woods. The whole time they were tracking it, they both had this awful sensation that they were being watched. From time to time, they would hear a sound a ways ahead of them, like a big animal moving through the trees, but they could never quite catch up to it. At one point, they started hearing noises behind them. And they started to wonder if it was possible that this thing had run ahead of them and then looped back around and was now tracking them. They were feeling really unsettled. They had been following the tracks for hours and were about to just give up and go home. They followed the trail to a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing, they found something neither of them had ever seen before, a tiny, run-down cabin. And they could see that the tracks they had been following led right up to the front door. They followed the prints all the way to the cabin, and the tracks stopped right outside a single door. The door was shut. They stood there for a moment, thinking, what kind of animal can open and shut a door? It had to be a person. Dennis started banging on the door, yelling for whoever was inside to come out. He was shouting things like, "We know you were at Keith's property. Get out here. We followed you. We know it's you." There was no sound from inside. No movement at all. They tried looking in the windows, but they couldn't see anything. Then Keith had a moment of clarity. He realized this was a bad look for them. They had tracked this person to their home, and they were standing outside with guns. They couldn't be there. They needed to leave and just let it go. After a few more choice words for the person inside, they left. They decided not to go back through the woods. They walked to the nearest road they could hear nearby and found a payphone. Keith called his father, who came to pick them up. When they got in the car, Keith's dad saw the rifles and asked what was going on. Keith and Dennis explained the whole story, and they described the cabin in the woods they had just been at. And Keith's dad said, "Oh, I know who lives in that cabin. It's this guy who works at the tire shop. He's a loner type, an older guy. Nobody really knows much about him." Dennis immediately said they had to go to that tire shop. He wanted to get a look at this guy. Keith was a little hesitant. He didn't want to blow this out of proportion, but they ultimately decided to go. Their plan was to bring a beat-up old tire to the shop and ask to get it repaired, just as an excuse to see the person who apparently owned the cabin. So they drove to the tire shop. They knew the person at the front desk wasn't the guy they were looking for. It was the mechanic who worked in the back. They handed the tire over, and the front desk guy yelled back into the garage, "Hey, George, come out here. You got a tire." Keith would later describe George as coming out of the shadows. He was a huge man, about 6'5" and older. He looked up at Keith and Dennis, and he had these striking orange eyes. Keith said it was the most distinctive set of eyes he had ever seen. And as George looked at them, there was a moment of clear recognition. George was looking at the two men who had just tracked him to his house. And Keith and Dennis were looking at him, thinking, "We know it was you." They all knew. George looked down, grabbed the tire without a word, and walked back into the garage. When he was finished fixing it, he just rolled it out to the middle of the floor, staying in the shadows. Keith and Dennis were sure that he didn't want to show his face again. He knew that they knew. They paid for the repair and left, totally weirded out. It was so strange. He was an old guy. He kind of fit the description. He was big enough to have 14-inch feet, but none of it really added up. How is an old guy like that climbing on roofs and jumping 20 feet? Keith was in a tough spot. He couldn't tell the police what had happened because he would have to admit that he stalked a man to his house with a rifle. And he couldn't prove that George had committed any crime. And he didn't want to tell his wife. He knew she would not only have a huge "I told you so" moment, but she would immediately want to move. And he just didn't have the money to sell their new house and move again. So he decided to just keep it to himself and hope that he never ran into George again. For a few months, there were no more sightings of anything strange at their house. Then, in March of 1982, about 3 months after their encounter with George at the tire shop, Dennis showed up at Keith's house unexpectedly. He told Keith to get in the car. He wanted to show him something. Keith got in, and as they started driving, he could tell that Dennis was taking him toward George's cabin in the woods. Keith told Dennis they couldn't do this. They couldn't go to this guy's house again. They knew he did it, but what were they going to do about it? And Dennis just looked at him and said, "No, I just found out that George died. He's dead." So we can go check out his place now. Keith felt a little bad about it, but he was also incredibly curious. So he agreed. They started driving down the access road that led to George's cabin, and they found a police car parked in the middle of the road, blocking it. It turned out that Dennis knew the cop. He got out and explained the whole strange story about the cabin and how it related to them. At first, the cop was very reluctant to share any information about why he was there or what was going on. But eventually, he relented. The officer said, "Actually, I'm here because there is some strangeness with this cabin. We don't really know what to make of it. If you want, I can give you a quick peek at what it looks like inside." Keith and Dennis were super intrigued. They said yes, absolutely. So the officer led them into the tiny cabin, and there was almost nothing in it. There was a single chair and a small table, and that was it. There were no personal effects, no food, no clothes, nothing. It was just this empty, tiny space. Keith and Dennis were shocked. This guy was living like a complete hermit. They thought that this was what the cop was talking about when he mentioned the weirdness of the cabin. They were saying how crazy it was that George had lived like this for 40 years. But the cop said, "No, that's not the weird part." He walked over to a sheet that was hanging down against one of the walls. He said, "That's the weird part." He reached out, pulled the sheet aside, and revealed a sliding metal door. The officer slid the heavy door open, and they were immediately hit with this overpowering smell, like a gross, wet dog. They stepped inside. They were in a small cell. The walls were lined with thick plates of steel, with metal strips and rivets holding everything in place. It was like a metal-encased tomb. In the middle of the floor was a 10-foot chain bolted to the concrete. At the end of the chain, there were heavy shackles for wrists and for feet, and all over the steel walls, there were scratch marks. Old scratches, new scratches, deep gouges in the metal, everywhere. The police officer just looked at them and said, "Yeah, we're trying to figure out what old George was doing with this cell in his cabin in the middle of the woods." Keith and Dennis didn't say a word. They left the cabin, got back in their car, and just drove away in silence. Neither of them talked about what they saw, but they both knew. They knew that something had been held in that cage. And that something had been the thing they tracked through the woods. It had been the thing that was stalking Keith's property. It was the thing with the orange eyes that was staring in the windows. It was all incredibly unsettling, but Keith, Dennis, and Diane never found out for sure what it was. Keith did say, though, that after George died, there was no more stalking at his property. They never saw the glowing eyes in the woods again. So no matter what it was, something was showing up at Keith and Diane's house, looking in their windows and stalking them. Something made those huge tracks, got on the roof of their house, ran into the woods, and made its way back to George's cabin. We don't know if that something was just George himself, or if it was some creature, some animal that he was keeping in that cage, or if it was something else entirely. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell decided to do something a little different for their wedding. They flew out to Las Vegas, Nevada, and found their way to the famous Little Vegas Chapel just off the Strip. They were married by a man dressed as Elvis Presley right in front of a classic pink Cadillac. For some people, it might have seemed a bit unusual, but for James and Brittany, it was perfect. It fit them. After all, they weren't a very traditional couple to begin with. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was a ball of energy. She was bubbly, outgoing, and she even described herself as being a little bit crazy. She was the kind of person who lit up a room. James, on the other hand, was 35 and her complete opposite. He was quiet, reserved, and very analytical. He was the type to think things through carefully and rarely ever acted on impulse. This contrast in their personalities wasn't new. In fact, they had dated once before, way back in high school. It hadn't worked out then. They broke up, went their separate ways, and probably figured they'd never see each other again. But life has a funny way of bringing people back together. Nearly 2 decades later, they reconnected by chance. And this time, things were different. They both had something major in common that changed everything. James was a single father, raising 2 young boys on his own. He was searching for a partner, someone not just to share his life with, but someone who could be a mother figure to his children. As for Brittany, she was also single, and she had always dreamed of being a mother. The timing of their reunion just felt right, like it was meant to be. A year after their Elvis-officiated wedding, life threw them another big change. James was serving in the U.S. Navy, and he received new orders. He was being stationed for a couple of years at a naval base in Hawaii. For the family of 4, this was a huge adventure. They packed up everything they owned, gathered their little cat, Mr. Franklin, and left the mainland United States behind. They landed in Honolulu, the capital of Hawaii, ready to start their new life. They moved into a 2-story house in a suburb just a few minutes from the airport. It was a nice, quiet neighborhood, situated at the end of a cul-de-sac. The area didn't exactly look like the tropical paradise you might picture when you think of Hawaii. It was more like a typical American suburb. The houses were all very similar, these cookie-cutter 2-story homes lined up next to each other, many with white picket fences out front. For the Campbells, who were used to life on the mainland, this familiar sight was actually comforting. It helped them settle in. It didn't take long for them to fall in love with their new home in Hawaii. That is, until they started to uncover the house's dark secret. It began in June of 2019, not long after they had moved in. Brittany needed to get something from the garage. Their garage was attached to the left side of the house, and there was a door on the first floor that led directly into it. So Brittany walked through the house, opened that door, and stepped into the garage. She reached for the light switch and flipped it on. What she saw when the light flooded the space made no sense at all. They had only been in Hawaii for a few weeks, so there were still a ton of moving boxes they hadn't gotten around to unpacking. They had stacked them all up neatly inside the garage to deal with later. But now, as Brittany stood there, she saw that almost all of those boxes had been knocked over. Their contents were spilled out all over the concrete floor. It was a huge mess. But what was truly bizarre was that it didn't look like a random act of chaos. It looked intentional. Someone had seemingly gone through the boxes, sifting through their belongings. They had taken out random items and arranged them in strange little piles. The objects in each pile had no connection to each other. In other places, items were stood up in odd arrangements, almost like they were being displayed for a garage sale. Brittany's first instinct was to just back away. She turned around, left the garage, and went to find her husband. She brought James back to the garage door, and he looked inside just as confused as she was. The two of them immediately went into the garage and started looking through the mess, trying to see if anything valuable was missing. It was hard to tell for sure given the chaos, but they did have some expensive items packed in those boxes. Those items had been pulled out, but they were still there, lying on the ground. This was a pretty good sign that this wasn't a robbery. So, if it wasn't a burglar, what was it? The only other explanation they could come up with was their 2 young sons. Maybe the boys had been playing in the garage, gotten a bit too rough, and knocked everything over. But when James and Brittany asked them, the boys swore they hadn't done it. Brittany believed them. James, however, was more skeptical. He thought they might just be lying to stay out of trouble. And if it wasn't the kids, he figured maybe it was one of their pets. They had gotten a dog shortly after arriving in Hawaii, so now they had a dog and a cat. James was trying to find any logical explanation, and he was very dismissive of how genuinely spooked Brittany was by the whole thing. But there was nothing else to do. They cleaned up the garage, put everything back, and tried to move on. About a week later, another strange thing happened. Brittany was home alone one morning, getting ready for the day. She was sitting at her vanity in the master bedroom, carefully applying her eyeliner while a makeup tutorial played on YouTube. As she focused on her reflection, a loud sound from downstairs made her jump. The front door had slammed shut with incredible force. She was so startled, she almost poked herself in the eye. She immediately paused the video. The house was silent again. She called out, "James?" Boys, thinking they must have come home without her realizing it. But nobody answered. Her mind started racing, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe James and the boys had just opened the door to drop something off, slammed it on their way out, and didn't hear her call. But a part of her felt that something was wrong. The memory of the trashed garage was still fresh in her mind. She had tried to forget about it, but it was always there, in the back of her thoughts. She stood up and walked towards the open bedroom door, which led out into the second-floor hallway. From her bedroom, you could look straight across the hall to her son's bedroom door. In between the two rooms, to the left, was the staircase leading down to the first floor. At the bottom of those stairs, right in front of you, was the front door. The very door she had just heard slam. Brittany cautiously stepped into the hallway. She looked around, but saw no one. She called out for her family again, louder this time. Again, only silence answered. Taking a deep breath, she started walking down the hallway. When she reached the halfway point, she turned left and started down the stairs. The house was eerily quiet. A growing sense of dread was building in her stomach. She quietly called out for James and her sons one more time, but there was still no response. When she got to the bottom of the stairs, she scanned the first floor. Nothing seemed out of place. She walked over to the front door and pulled it open, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or any sign that her family had been there. But there was nothing. The driveway was empty. There was no one around. It was just her. Her heart was pounding now. She shut the front door and made sure to lock it. Then she did a full sweep of the first floor. She checked every single window and every door, making sure they were all securely locked. She went back upstairs and did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was nobody else in the house. She was completely alone. She went back to her room, her mind reeling. How could she explain it? She knew what she heard. She had clearly heard the front door slam shut. But there was no one there to have done it. She eventually had to leave the house to go about her day, but the incident stuck with her. That evening, when she got home, James and the boys were there. She brought up the slamming door, asking James if he had maybe stopped by the house earlier. He told her no, he hadn't been back all day. It couldn't have been him. He tried to reassure her, saying, "Don't worry, you probably just left the door unlocked and a draft came through and slammed it shut. You have nothing to worry about." But Brittany knew that wasn't possible. She was meticulous about locking the doors. The idea that she had not only forgotten to lock it, but had also left it ajar just enough for a gust of wind to slam it that hard, it just didn't make sense. But James was being dismissive again, just like he had been about the garage. He told her she was being paranoid and that it was just a door. This frustrated Brittany, and soon they were in a full-blown argument. By the time they went to bed that night, they were angry and not even speaking to each other. They fell asleep in silence. Then, in the middle of the night, Brittany woke up suddenly. She didn't know what had woken her, but she sat up in bed, looking around the dark, quiet room. As she tried to get her bearings, she heard it. Downstairs. It wasn't a slam this time. It was the distinct sound of a door opening and then quietly shutting. Immediately, her senses were on high alert. She stayed perfectly still, leaning forward, listening intently. She had to be sure she wasn't imagining it. And then she heard it again. A different door, downstairs, opening and then shutting. Panic started to set in. She reached over and shook James awake. She whispered urgently, "James, I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." James was not happy about being woken up. He was still mad at her from their fight earlier, and now she was waking him up in a panic about more doors. He was annoyed. He sat up, clearly not taking her seriously. Brittany could sense his frustration, and she got straight to the point. "James, did you lock the front door before we went to bed?" James sighed. "Yes, I locked the front door." "I'm telling you, you're just hearing things." There's nothing going on in this house. But Brittany was not convinced. She said, "You can think that if you want, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." She got out of bed and walked to the bedroom door. She peered out into the dark hallway. She didn't see or hear anything. Very slowly, she crept down the hall until she reached the top of the stairs. She stood there for a moment, looking down into the pitch-black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there. She had to protect her family. So, one step at a time, she went down the stairs. When she reached the bottom, she immediately looked at the front door, and her heart sank. It was unlocked. Her first thought was, why would James lie to me? Why would he say he locked it when he didn't? Then another thought occurred to her. Maybe it was her sons. Maybe they had gotten out of bed and come downstairs, unlocking the door. That must be what she was hearing. It had to be the boys making all that noise. For a second, she felt a wave of relief. That made sense. But after she locked the front door, she searched the entire first floor, and her sons were nowhere to be found. She went back upstairs and quietly opened their bedroom door. She found both of them fast asleep in their beds. When she gently shook them awake, they were completely groggy and out of it. There was no way they had been running around the house just a few minutes earlier. Now, Brittany was truly terrified. She tucked her boys back in, told them everything was fine, and then hurried back to her own bedroom. She told James what she had found. The front door was unlocked, and the boys were sound asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James was still being dismissive. He told her she was overreacting, that she was just being paranoid, and that the sounds she was hearing were just the house settling. And as he was saying this, they both heard a loud noise from downstairs. The back sliding glass door, the one that led to their backyard, suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. In that instant, everything changed for James. The skepticism vanished from his face. He looked at his wife, his eyes wide, and said, "You stay right here." He jumped out of bed and ran out of the room. A few minutes later, he came back. He told Brittany that the back door had been unlocked, but it was shut now. He tried to downplay it again, saying she must have forgotten to lock that one too, and that the same draft was probably causing all the problems. He said, "The house is all locked up now. Let's just go to sleep." Brittany couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you kidding me?" she said. "There is something weird happening in our house. The garage, the doors opening and shutting. You can't just pretend like nothing is going on." This led to another big fight. Before long, they weren't even talking about the mysterious noises anymore. They were just arguing with each other. Eventually, exhausted, they both just gave up and went back to sleep. For the next few weeks, things in the house were quiet. But Brittany couldn't stop thinking about it. Who or what was opening and shutting their doors? What had happened in the garage? Meanwhile, James continued to act like nothing was wrong. He refused to talk about the possibility that something strange was happening in their home. But then, something strange happened to James when he was all alone. And for the first time, he got really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the night of the slamming doors. James was home by himself during the day. He decided to sit down and play the piano, which was in their living room on the first floor. He sat down and began to play. After a little while, he started to get an uncomfortable feeling. He felt like he was being watched. The feeling grew so strong that he had to stop playing. He looked around the room, trying to make sure he was actually alone. As he scanned the room, he glanced at the window to his right, which looked out onto the side yard. And he saw it. There was a figure standing right outside the window, looking in. The curtain was drawn, so all he could see was a dark silhouette. It was just standing there, with its arms down by its sides. James was startled. As soon as he reacted, the figure quickly moved away towards the back of the house. James jumped up from the piano bench and rushed over to another window, one that looked into the backyard. He looked outside, but there was no one there. He went back to the first window, the one where he saw the figure, and pulled the curtain back. Again, no one. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself it must have been a nosy neighbor who heard the music and came to see who was playing. Maybe they saw him, noticed them, and ran off before he could get a good look. That had to be it. But deep down, the image of that dark figure in the window really shook him up. However, it was the blanket incident that finally broke through James's wall of skepticism. It was the moment that forced him to admit to his wife that they had a serious problem. Not long after James saw the figure, the whole family decided to go out to a movie. As they were getting ready to leave, Brittany said she wanted to bring a specific blanket with them. It was a family favorite, the one they always used when they were cuddling on the couch. She thought it would be nice to have it at the theater. She went into the living room to grab it, but the blanket was gone. It wasn't on the couch where it always was. She asked James and the boys if they had seen it, but they all said no. She looked everywhere. She checked under the couch, all around the living room, and even went upstairs to search. But the blanket was nowhere to be found. Finally, they just gave up and left for the movie without it. But when they came home that evening, there it was. Lying on the couch, folded up perfectly neat, was the missing blanket. Everyone in the family knew for a fact that the blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, James and Brittany did their best to put on a brave face for their kids, telling them that everything was fine. But in reality, the whole family was terrified to be in that house. The strange occurrences were getting worse. At night, the doors would still open and shut on their own. Their dog would start barking uncontrollably in the middle of the night for no reason, and they all shared the same awful, constant feeling of being watched. By September of that year, the family had reached a breaking point. They decided they had to get out of the house, even if it was just for a little while. They needed a break from the constant fear. So they packed their bags, flew back to the mainland, and stayed with family for a week. On September 20th, they got back on a plane and flew back to Honolulu. As they drove from the airport to their house, both James and Brittany were secretly hoping that their time away had somehow reset things, that whatever weirdness was plaguing their home would have just magically stopped. But as soon as James turned onto their street, they knew that wasn't going to be the case. As they drove up the road, they could see their house at the end of the cul-de-sac. And sitting right in the middle of their driveway was James's nice road bike. Brittany turned to her husband. Even though she already knew the answer, she had to ask. "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" James just shook his head, no, his eyes fixed on the house. He hadn't touched it. He pulled the car into the driveway, parking right in front of the garage door. After he put the car in park, he pressed the button for the garage door opener. James was in the driver's seat, Brittany was next to him, and the kids were in the back. They all watched as the garage door slowly began to rise. As soon as they could see inside, their jaws dropped. The entire garage had been completely trashed. It wasn't just that things were dumped out. Things had been ripped apart, shredded, as if a wild animal had been let loose inside. James immediately turned to his wife and said, "We've been robbed. He jumped out of the car and told his kids, "Stay in the car! Do not get out." James then went to the side of the house and grabbed a sledgehammer for protection. He made his way to the front door of the house while Brittany stayed by the car on the phone with 911 reporting a break-in. James reached the front door. He put his key in the lock and turned it. The door was unlocked. With the heavy sledgehammer in one hand, he tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Something was blocking it from the other side. James put his shoulder against the door and pushed with all his might. Finally, it opened just a crack, just enough for him to see inside. As he peered through the narrow opening, trying to figure out what was going on, a pair of eyes suddenly met his from behind the door. Before James could even react, a man's voice from inside the house said calmly, "This is not your house." And then the man tried to push the door shut on him. An adrenaline-fueled rage took over James. He roared and smashed the door open with his body. He grabbed the man inside, yanked him out of the house, and threw him onto the front lawn. James then stood over him, holding the sledgehammer, and warned him, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." The intruder, a 2-3-year-old man named Ezekiel Zayas, didn't try to run. He just stood there on the Campbell's lawn, staring directly at James, unblinking and eerily calm. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. Ezekiel didn't put up a fight. He was arrested and taken away without any resistance. It was only after Ezekiel was gone that James and Brittany finally went inside their house. What they found was a scene of total devastation. The entire house, just like the garage, had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos, they noticed something familiar. There were those strange little piles of random objects, just like they had seen in the garage that very first time. There were stacks of coasters, books, and electronics arranged on various surfaces, but what really caught James's attention were the medical vials. All over the first floor, on tables and counters, were small vials of drugs or chemicals. He knew they didn't belong to his family. Someone had brought them into the house. James made his way up the stairs to the second floor. The upstairs was just as destroyed as the downstairs, a mess of overturned furniture and strewn belongings. But when he turned and went into his son's room, he was shocked. The room was pristine. In fact, it looked like it had been professionally cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded and stacked on a chair. Their beds were made with military precision. All of their toys, which were usually all over the floor, were neatly put away in their proper places. Stunned, James left his boys' room and walked across the hall into the master bedroom. And what he saw in there made an already terrible situation 1,000 times worse. The master bedroom was destroyed, just like the rest of the house. But the bed was different. The top of their bed was clear of any junk. Instead, a towel had been laid out neatly across it, like a tablecloth. And arranged on this towel, spaced apart perfectly, was a collection of knives. Next to the knives, also on the towel, was a laptop. It was a laptop the Campbell family owned, but they rarely used it. It was open, but the screen was dark. By this point, Brittany had come upstairs and was standing beside him. Together, they walked over to the bed, horrified by the display. They touched the keyboard of the laptop, and the screen lit up, showing the last thing that had been worked on. It was a long, typed document, a Word file that neither of them had ever seen before. They scrolled to the top. The document was titled The Omnivore Trials. Below that, a subtitle read, A Rehabilitation for Rat-Like People. The rest of the document was like a diary. It was filled with page after page of detailed observations about a group of specimens, and it was terrifyingly clear that the specimens were the Campbell family. The observations were incredibly intimate. The only way someone could have known these details was if they had been watching the family up close almost constantly for days, weeks, and even months. The notes ranged from what time the family liked to watch TV to the private conversations James and Brittany had behind their closed bedroom door. It even mentioned their personal struggle to have another child, something they hadn't told anyone in their family. In the document, the author wrote that the creature, referring to Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and focus on the children she already had. Towards the end of the long document, the author of The Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion. They wrote that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. The specific surgeries mentioned were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. Following this conclusion was another section. It was a detailed list of all the surgical tools the author would need to perform these procedures. There was also a list of drugs and chemicals they would need to sedate the specimens before the surgeries began. As James and Brittany stood there reading this in horror, it all clicked into place. The knives laid out on the towel next to them were not random. Those were the surgical tools. And all of those strange medical vials they had seen downstairs, those were the drugs. The drugs that were going to be used to sedate them so Ezekiel could perform his surgeries. It turned out that for months, Ezekiel Zayas had found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbells' home. He had been living there right alongside them since around the time they first moved in. His primary hiding spot was the crawl space above the second-floor bathroom. Whenever he could, he would climb down from his hiding place and move through the house, observing the family. Based on the details in his document, it was clear he was watching them not just at night, but during the day as well. He was the one who had trashed the garage and arranged their belongings. He was the one opening and shutting the doors. He was the one who had taken the blanket and then returned it, folded neatly. He was the dark figure James had seen in the window. The document also made it chillingly clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to act. He was preparing to carry out his twisted plan. The Campbells' decision to go on that one-week vacation might have been the very thing that saved their lives. It had interrupted his timeline. And if there was any doubt about whether Ezekiel was capable of such extreme violence, that question was answered after his arrest. While he was in jail awaiting trial for what he did to the Campbells, he allegedly beat his cellmate to death. A guard reportedly walked in and saw Ezekiel punching, kicking, and stomping on the man. The man later died from his injuries. As of today, Ezekiel Zayas is in a state hospital. Doctors are still trying to determine if he is mentally fit to stand trial, both for what he did to the Campbell family and for the alleged murder of his cellmate. It's still a complete mystery what his motives were. We have no idea why he targeted the Campbells or what he hoped to achieve with his so-called omnivore trials. As for the Campbell family, the experience was so deeply traumatic that they couldn't stay in that house. They moved away immediately. For their own safety and peace of mind, their current whereabouts are unknown. They simply vanished, hoping to leave the nightmare of that house, and the man who lived in their walls far behind them. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, a 35-year-old man named Tristan Baudet woke up early. The first thing he did was grab his phone to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is a sprawling, beautiful suburb nestled between the massive cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. It was here that Tristan, his 36-year-old wife, Erica Wu, and their two little girls, who were just 2 and 4 years old, had built their life. And on this particular morning, which just so happened to be Father's Day, Tristan was hoping for good news. He had a plan. He wanted to take his whole family out for a perfect day at the beach to celebrate. He watched as the weather app loaded on his phone and a smile spread across his face. The forecast was for clear skies and sunshine all day. But honestly, even if the app had predicted rain and cold, Tristan probably would have tried to convince everyone to go to the beach anyway. For Tristan, being outdoors was his happy place. It didn't matter if it was hiking in the mountains, camping under the stars, or just tossing a frisbee in a park. If he was outside, he was content. This love for nature was something he had already passed down to his two young daughters. They were his little adventure sidekicks, always eager to explore the world with their dad. It made Tristan incredibly happy to see them falling in love with the same things he did. His wife Erica, she enjoyed the outdoors too, but maybe not with the same level of passion as Tristan. But that was perfectly fine with him. Tristan was the kind of person who just went with the flow. He would make small adjustments to make sure she was comfortable. For instance, whenever they went camping, he was happy to rough it in a tent on the hard ground. But he would always pack a big, full-sized inflatable mattress just for Erica. And it wasn't just about the mattress. It was about his entire personality. Erica adored him for it. He was just so easygoing and accepting of people as they were. He never judged anyone. He was just at peace with the world. In fact, that exact quality was what first drew Erica to him all those years ago. They had met back in high school. Some mutual friends had set them up because Tristan needed a date for a school dance. Erica agreed to go with him, and the night of the dance was the first time she ever laid eyes on him. And he was quite a sight. Over the summer, he had shot up a few inches in height, but hadn't quite filled out yet, so he was tall and very lanky. And for this dance, he was completely overdressed in a full tuxedo, but he wasn't self-conscious about it at all. He was just genuinely excited to be there with a date. And all night long, Tristan owned that tuxedo, dancing with all his lanky, gangly glory as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He made it his mission to make sure Erica had a great time, and she absolutely did. After that night, the two of them were pretty much inseparable. Their lives took them on impressive paths. Erica went on to study at Stanford University and became a successful OBGYN doctor. Tristan became a brilliant and widely published scientist. He even held a patent related to vaccine delivery. On paper, his resume was unbelievable, stacked with achievements, but all that success never changed the core of who Tristan was. His colleagues at the lab, who all loved him, found it hilarious. Here was this genius chemist working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, a guy doing incredibly complex research, who was also this laid-back person who walked around the lab starting most of his sentences with the word dude. By early afternoon on that Father's Day, the Bodette family had made their way to a local beach. Erica settled into a beach chair with a book, while Tristan and the two little girls set up a sunshade right at the edge of the water. They started digging in the sand, building little castles. Every so often, Erica would look up from her book and watch them. She'd see them laughing as they dug. Then they'd suddenly abandon their project and run into the shallow surf, shrieking with delight as they tried to outrun these small, gentle waves that crashed around their ankles. At one point, Erica looked up and saw her daughters having the time of their lives, and then she saw Tristan look over at her. He flashed her this huge, happy grin. And in that one single moment, watching her family, Erica felt a sense of pure contentment wash over her. It was a feeling that didn't always come easily to her. Unlike Tristan, who could just relax and enjoy life as it came, Erica was a constant worrier. This anxiety traced all the way back to when she was just 8 years old. That was the year she lost her father. It was a deeply traumatic event that had devastated her family and cast a long shadow over her childhood. Ever since then, she had lived with a persistent, quiet fear that no matter how good things were, something terrible was always just around the corner, waiting to ruin it all. But sitting there on the beach, seeing that smile on her husband's face, and hearing the laughter of her children, that fear melted away. It was a perfect moment. So Erica put her book down, got up from her chair, and ran to join her family in the water. She had no way of knowing that her deepest fear was about to become a reality. 4 days later, on Thursday, June 21st, the atmosphere at their home was very different. Erica was trying to study for a huge medical exam she was scheduled to take the very next day. But with Tristan and their two energetic daughters at home, the house was loud and chaotic. It was impossible for her to focus. Tristan could see the stress on her face. He also knew that on top of the exam, they were only a week away from a massive life change. They were moving to San Francisco. They had already put a deposit down on a new house up there, closer to some of their family. It was a good move for them, but it added another huge layer of pressure. Looking at his wife, Tristan knew she needed a break. She needed some peace and quiet to study and prepare. And so, he came up with a plan. He decided he would take the girls and get out of the house for the weekend. He made a couple of quick phone calls. A little while later, he went to Erica and told her what he had arranged. He had booked a campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another one of those iconic Southern California towns about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Orange County. It's known for being a wealthy enclave where celebrities live, and he told her that he had also called his brother-in-law, Scott, who had two young sons of his own, ages 3 and 5. The plan was for all of them to go camping together for the weekend. Erica was incredibly grateful. She really did need the time and space to study. But at the same time, a familiar sense of worry started to creep in. Tristan often took the girls on little adventures, but he had never taken them camping overnight by himself without her there. Her first instinct was to object, to say it wasn't a good idea. But Tristan, who knew his wife so well, reassured her. He told her not to worry. He promised he would take great care of the kids. He explained that it was a very public, well-known campground with lots of other people around. He promised it was totally safe. Eventually, Erica was convinced. So Tristan started packing up the car. He loaded in all the camping gear, the kids' toys, and their little bikes. As he worked, the girls were buzzing with excitement about their big camping trip. But Erica couldn't shake a bad feeling. A part of her was silently hoping that something would happen and they would have to cancel the trip. She just felt like something bad was about to happen. But nothing happened to stop them. After the car was all packed and the girls were buckled into their car seats, Tristan came over to Erica. He gave her a kiss goodbye and told her he'd see her in a couple of days. He wished her good luck on her test. And with that, he got into the driver's seat, backed out of the driveway, and headed up the road towards Malibu. Erica stood and watched until the car disappeared from sight. That night, Erica studied late into the evening before finally going to bed. The next morning, she woke up early. She was feeling anxious about the test, and she was still worried about Tristan and the girls. As she was getting ready for her day, she heard a loud, insistent knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock. It was only 6:45 inches the morning. It made no sense. No one should be knocking on her door at this hour. Maybe it was Tristan, but if it were him, he would have just used his key. Apprehensively, she walked to the front of the house and opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing on her porch, she knew. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Erica would later look back on that moment opening the door. And even though it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare still have happened? But she did open the door, and standing there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla. Priscilla lived an hour and a half away and was completely unannounced. Her face was frantic and tear-streaked. And then Priscilla gave Erica the most heartbreaking news a person could ever receive. The words were so shocking, so world-shattering, that Erica's mind literally could not process them. She kept thinking, this can't be true. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not be taking her medical exam that day. Instead, she got into the car with Priscilla, and they began the long, silent drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls had arrived at the entrance to Malibu Creek State Park. When you think of Malibu, you probably picture mansions on the beach. But just inland from the coast, the landscape changes dramatically. It becomes rugged and wild, full of deep canyons and dense forests, and nestled right in the middle of all this wilderness is the state park. Tristan and his brother-in-law Scott pulled up to the gate, checked in with the park rangers, and were given directions to their campsites. They had reserved 2 spots right next to each other. A campsite in a place like this is usually just a simple square plot of dirt, maybe with a fire pit. It's just enough space to pitch a tent. So Tristan and Scott drove across the campground to their assigned spots. But as soon as they got there, Tristan realized the spots weren't very good. They were located right next to the portable toilets, so there was a bit of a smell, and a lot of people were walking back and forth. The ground was also on a slight slope, which would make sleeping uncomfortable. It just wasn't ideal. Scott agreed, so he decided to go back and talk to the rangers to see if they could move. He drove back to the entrance, spoke with a ranger, and it turned out to be no problem at all. The ranger told him there were 2 other open sites on the far side of the park, and they could just swap their reservation. So Tristan and Scott packed everything back up and drove over to the new spots. And these ones were perfect. They were tucked away at the base of a huge sloping canyon wall, far from any bathrooms or foot traffic. It felt private and secluded, and the ground was perfectly flat. The 2 men were thrilled. They started unloading their cars and setting up their tents, while the 4 kids ran around playing and riding their small bikes. Once the tents were up, they built a fire in the fire pit, which was situated right between the 2 campsites. Scott would be sleeping in his tent with his 2 sons, and Tristan would be in his tent with his 2 daughters. As the sun went down, they all gathered around the fire. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, that classic camping treat of marshmallows, chocolate, so graham crackers. The dads told funny jokes and some not too spooky stories. Before long, all 4 kids were completely exhausted. So Scott and Tristan each took their own children and tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tents. After the kids were settled, the 2 men came back out to the fire. Tristan had brought some pre-made cocktails, and he shared one with Scott. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet of the night and each other's company. Tristan talked a lot about the upcoming move to San Francisco, and Scott was happy to just sit and listen. Eventually, they were both tired too. They decided it was time to call it a night. They carefully put out the fire. Scott gave Tristan a hug and told him he loved him. Then the 2 men went to their separate tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his sleeping sons, he looked across the now dark fire pit towards Tristan's tent. He could just make out the silhouette of Tristan climbing inside with his girls. After seeing that, Scott zipped up his own tent, lay down, and within about 15 minutes, he was fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next morning, around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he had heard a loud noise, but he was groggy and couldn't quite place what it was. He lay there in the dark, listening. And as he got his bearings, he realized that one of Tristan's daughters was crying in the other tent. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Kids cry. He figured Tristan would comfort her in a minute, and she would go back to sleep. But the crying didn't stop. It just continued. Scott knew that Tristan was a notoriously heavy sleeper, so he started to think, okay, maybe he just hasn't woken up yet. That must be why he's not calming his daughter down. So Scott carefully got out of his sleeping bag, trying not to wake his own sons. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and it was still dark. He couldn't see anything inside of Tristan's tent. He walked over to it, and by the time he got there, he could hear Tristan's daughter still crying, clear as day. Scott called out in a loud whisper, "Hey, Tristan. Tristan, wake up!" But there was no response. Nothing. With the little girl still crying just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, Scott decided he had to look inside. He walked around to the front of the tent, found the zipper, and pulled it open. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see clearly. But even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the shapes. He could see Tristan lying still in the middle of the tent. On either side of him were his two daughters. It looked like the 2-year-old was the one who was crying, and the 4-year-old was awake too, whimpering and trying her best to comfort her little sister. As Scott was trying to figure out what was going on, the two little girls turned and looked up at him. When they saw him, they both started saying the same word over and over. Wet, wet, wet. Scott had no idea what they meant. He was starting to feel a surge of panic. He knew something was very wrong. He reached into the tent and started shaking Tristan's shoulder, saying, "Hey, wake up," but the second he touched him, he knew. He knew instantly. Tristan wasn't sleeping. Tristan was dead. And his two little girls were sitting right next to him in a pool of his blood. Just before Scott had woken up, someone, somewhere nearby in the darkness of the park, had fired a gun. One of the bullets from that gun had traveled through the night, pierced the thin wall of Tristan's tent, and had struck him directly in the head as he slept peacefully between his two daughters. About 2 hours after that, Priscilla arrived on Erica's doorstep to tell her what had happened. To tell her that her husband was gone and that her two little girls were now going to grow up without a father, just like she did. The news didn't just break Erica's heart, it completely shattered her world. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda was eventually arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long and violent criminal history, and at the time of the shooting, he was living illegally off the grid deep in the canyons of that very same park. When police finally caught up to him, he was in possession of a rifle. And ballistics tests later confirmed that it was the same rifle that had fired the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial has been a long and difficult process. It's been repeatedly delayed because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys. Although he insists that he is innocent, his behavior in court has done nothing to help his case. He has been so violent and erratic during his court appearances that he has to be strapped into a special chair by his wrists and legs. They even have to put a device called a spit hood over his head to stop him from spitting at or biting people. Assuming that he was the shooter, which the evidence strongly suggests he was, the motive appears to be completely random. It's believed he didn't know Tristan at all. He just, for whatever reason, fired his gun that night. Maybe he was firing recklessly into the darkness, or maybe he intentionally aimed at the tent. We don't know for sure. But either way, one of his bullets found its target, and Tristan Beaudet was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the story wasn't already tragic enough, one more detail emerged that made it even more distressing. Tristan's death was not the first shooting to happen in or around Malibu Creek State Park. In the year leading up to his murder, there had been an astounding 6 other shootings in the immediate area. And 2 of those shootings happened inside the very same campground where Tristan was killed. None of those other shootings had been fatal, but in all 6 cases, the person or people responsible were never caught. And it seemed the local police hadn't put much effort into investigating them. It wasn't until a father was killed in his tent next to his children that the stories of all these other unsolved shootings finally came to light. People started looking at a map and connecting the dots. They realized there was a pattern. There was a rogue shooter who had been active in that exact area for a year, and the public had never been warned. The campground was never closed. No one was told that there was a potential danger lurking in the wilderness there. And the big question everyone had was, why? We may get answers to those questions during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with Tristan's murder, but for all those other shootings as well. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several government agencies. Her lawsuit argues that her husband had no idea about the threat that existed in that park. If the authorities had just put up a single sign, a single warning to the public, Tristan, being the protective father he was, would have never ever taken his children there. And he would still be alive today. That lawsuit is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Strongsville, Ohio used to be one of those quiet, comfortable suburbs you see all over America. A place with nice homes, nice families, and a local mall. But in late 2017, something was discovered there that put the town on the map for all the wrong reasons. And to really understand what happened, we need to go back to early 2016, which is when this town's long nightmare really began. In early 2016, a couple named Bruce and Melinda Pleskovich, who had lived in Strongsville for a long time, got some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter Anna and her 20-year-old fiancé, a young man named Jeff, had just told them they were expecting a baby. It was going to be a little girl. And so, Bruce and Melinda were absolutely thrilled. They were finally going to be grandparents. But at the same time, they were a little worried. They knew that Anna and Jeff didn't have a lot of money. Anna was still living at home with her parents. She had a job as a waitress at the local Applebee's, but it didn't pay much. And as for Jeff, he had a decent job. He was a service technician for a heating and air company, but it wasn't enough to support a new family. In fact, he was still living with his own parents on the other side of town. So here you had this young couple so excited about their new baby, but Bruce and Melinda knew they needed some help. They knew their kids just weren't financially prepared for this huge step. So Bruce and Melinda talked it over. They decided the best way they could support Anna and Jeff was to make them an offer. They told Anna that she could invite Jeff to come and live with them in their house. That way, the two of them could be together, and once the baby was born, Bruce and Melinda could be right there to help out. It seemed like the perfect solution. It would let the young couple save up their money so they could eventually get a place of their own. When they told Anna about their plan, she was so happy and so grateful. She immediately called Jeff, and he was just as thrilled. He said yes, he would love to move in. So it took a few months to get everything sorted out, but finally, in June of 2016, Jeff moved out of his parents' house and into the Pleskovich home. And it was in that very same month that Anna and Jeff welcomed their baby daughter into the world. But almost as soon as Jeff moved in, some really strange and disturbing things started happening around the property. Just a few days after Jeff had settled in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor, having dinner at the kitchen table. At some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. Now, their property had this huge, sprawling backyard. It was almost like a big, open, communal space shared by a row of houses. So Jeff is looking out into this big yard, and he sees something strange off in the distance. It was dark out, so he couldn't quite make it out at first. He stood up and walked over to the window for a better look. And as he got closer, he could see them. Way off at the back edge of their property, there were 4 strangers. They were just standing there, looking like they were smoking something, and they were all staring up at the Pleskovich house. Jeff just stood there at the window, watching them, not sure what to think. He called Anna over to the window, and she came and stood next to him. The two of them are just looking out, trying to figure out what to do. On one hand, these 4 people they didn't know were clearly trespassing on their property. But on the other hand, they weren't really doing anything aggressive. They were just standing there, smoking and staring. Hot was then as they watched, one of the 4 people started walking up the property straight towards their house. The person stopped next to the family's trampoline, which was in the backyard, and started fiddling with it. At that point, Anna had seen enough. She said she didn't know what they were doing, but she felt totally uncomfortable. So she decided to call the police. The police came out, but by the time the squad car pulled up in front of the house, the 4 people in the back must have seen the flashing lights. They had taken off running. When the officer went into the backyard to look around, there was nobody there. And there was no sign that they had been there either. No cigarette butts, no footprints, nothing. They had just vanished into the night. The police officer told Jeff and Anna to call again if they came back, and then he left. A little while later, Bruce and Melinda got home, and Anna and Jeff told them what had happened. They all agreed it was incredibly strange. In all the decades they had lived in that house in Strongsville, they had never had anyone just wander onto their property and hang out in the middle of the night. For the next couple of days, the whole family was on edge, constantly checking the windows. But after a little while, as more time passed, the incident was mostly forgotten. Fast forward about 5 months to November of 2016. Anna was home alone one day with her young daughter. She was on the first floor towards the front of the house playing with the baby, and as she was playing, she suddenly heard a sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to open the sliding glass door. Her first thought was that it must be Jeff or one of her parents. Maybe they forgot their key or something. So she scooped up her daughter and started walking towards the back of the house to let them in. She walked into one of the back rooms, and before she even reached the door, she happened to look out one of the windows that faced the backyard. And what she saw made her freeze. Standing right there, with his face pressed up against the glass, was an unknown man. He was just staring into the house. Anna just stood there, completely frozen, staring back at him. Then the guy noticed her. He immediately ducked down out of view. Anna's mind was racing. This must have been the person who was trying to break in through the back door. She was home alone with her baby, and she had no idea what this man wanted or if he was going to try to break in again. So she just turned and ran. She ran back towards the front of the house, up the stairs, and into a bedroom. She locked the door behind her and called the police. But again, by the time the police arrived and searched the area, they couldn't find anyone. There was no sign of an attempted forced entry on the door either. The officers told her that they were sure it was a traumatic experience, but there was really nothing they could do. There was no evidence, and they had no idea who it could have been. They just told her to keep her doors locked and to call them back if she saw anyone suspicious on her property again. Naturally, after the police left, Anna called Jeff and her parents. They were horrified and rushed home to comfort her. After the initial shock wore off, the family started to wonder. They thought, do you think this could be connected to those 4 strangers they saw on the property a few months ago? It just seemed too weird to be a coincidence. But then that led to the bigger question, who were these people and what did they want? Why were they targeting their family? As far as they knew, the Pleskovic family didn't have any enemies. In fact, most people in Strongsville absolutely adored them, especially Melinda, the mother. For over 20 years, Melinda had been a middle school teacher in town, and her students loved her. She was also a huge part of the local soccer community. She had played in college and was still really passionate about it, so she was an amazing coach. And for many of the parents in Strongsville, Melinda was an inspiration. She wasn't just a mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him. She was so good to him, she included him in everything, and she gave him the best possible life. Anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, he was just beaming with happiness. Even though he couldn't speak, it was so obvious how much he loved his mom. But regardless of who these strangers were or why they were lurking around, the Pleskovic family was now completely on edge. They found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, terrified that these people were going to come back and try to break in again. And unfortunately, they did come back. In January of 2017, just 2 months after Anna saw that man at the window, Bruce's car was broken into. It had been parked in their driveway. Someone got inside and stole his laptop. So Bruce called the police again. He told them he was sure this was connected to the people who were harassing his family. The police seemed to believe him, and they started looking around and asking questions, but they never found the laptop or the person who took it. And so once again, the family was left on their own, and the police just said to let them know if anything else happened. A few months went by, and then in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night. Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on the first floor. And there they were again. Out at the very back of the property, in the exact same spot where she and Jeff had seen those 4 strangers a year before, were 3 more strangers. They were just standing there, looking up at the house. Horrified, Anna called out to Jeff, telling him there were people in the backyard. This time, Anna pulled out her phone and started calling the police. But as she was on the phone, Jeff got really upset. He was tired of these people harassing his family and making them feel unsafe in their own home. So he grabbed a flashlight and stormed out the back door to confront them himself. But as soon as Jeff stepped outside, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people turned and ran, vanishing into the darkness. So when the police finally showed up, they were already well aware of all the calls they'd been getting from this family. They went out and did a serious search of the area, but just like every other time, they found nothing. And so the family was told, once again, to call if they saw anything else. The very next month, in August, Anna was home with her daughter. Her mother, Melinda, was upstairs. Anna was in the playroom at the front of the house with the baby when she heard it again. That familiar sound of someone trying to open the back sliding glass door. Immediately, her heart started pounding. She knew what happened the last time she heard that sound. But she thought to herself, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if it's someone I know. So she picked up her daughter, stood up, and walked to the edge of the room she was in. She carefully peeked her head around the corner, down the hallway that gave her a clear view of the back sliding glass door. And when she finally saw who was there, she screamed. There were 2 large adults standing at the back door, actively trying to force it open. When she screamed, the 2 strangers heard her. They turned around and took off running. Melinda, who was upstairs, heard her daughter screaming and came flying down the stairs, trying to figure out what was wrong. Anna was hysterical, the baby was crying, and so Melinda was the one who called the police, this time to report what her daughter had just seen. The police came out, they searched the property, and they couldn't find anyone. So again, the police left. They told the family they were sorry this was happening, but they couldn't do anything without more evidence. They promised they would get out there as fast as they could if anything else happened, hoping that one of these times they would finally catch these people. But for now, they just didn't have much to go on. The next month, in September, one of Melinda's car keys went missing. And whoever had stolen it started using it to randomly start her car in the middle of the night. They also used it to set off her car alarm at all hours. During that same time, they also discovered that someone had jammed nails into the tires of Bruce's car. Of course, the family called the police and told them what was going on, but there was still nothing the police could do. Melinda was getting desperate. So she actually went on Facebook and made a post telling everyone that someone had stolen her keys and pleading for them to just give them back. In the post, she begged whoever was harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, the post didn't do any good. The harassment continued. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the back sliding glass door rattling. Now, he knew that every time Anna had heard that sound, there was always some stranger at the back door. So Jeff grabbed the family dog and he very carefully peered down the hallway towards the back door to see who was there. And right as he poked his head out, he saw him. It was a large adult figure wearing a hood, trying to open the door. The dog saw the person and started barking, running towards the door. Jeff ran after the dog. The person outside, trying to break in, saw the dog and Jeff running towards him, so he turned and ran away. Jeff and the dog stayed inside the house and just watched the guy take off across the property and disappear into the trees. Jeff called the police, but just like all the other times, they came out, and there was simply nothing they could do. Just 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked. They were going to have dinner there and have Anna be their waitress. After they finished eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, left the restaurant, got in their cars, and drove back to the house. When they got there, Bruce was the first one up the steps to the front door. It was locked, so he knocked. His son Kyle came and unlocked the door for him. Bruce went inside, followed closely by Jeff, who was carrying his daughter. They got inside, and Bruce walked through the house to the kitchen at the back. He flipped on the lights, and he saw something on the kitchen floor. When Jeff saw it, he immediately turned around and ran out of the house, carrying his daughter. He grabbed Kyle on the way out and just took them straight outside. Once Jeff was safely outside, he called 911. And when you listen to the recording of that call, it sounds like Jeff is in total shock, unable to even process what he has just seen. He told the operator that someone had been attacked in his house. He said it was Mel Pleskovich. He said he didn't know who did it, that they just came home and found her on the kitchen floor. Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda. She was lying on the kitchen floor. She had been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She was rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. The whole family was in shock, completely unable to process what had just happened. But they were all convinced of one thing. Whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of those strange and suspicious people who had been lurking around their property for almost 2 years. In fact, right after Jeff called 911, while he was still inside the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, Bruce made his own call to 911, and in it, he blamed the police department for not doing more. He told the operator to please come, that he thought his wife had been killed by someone. He said they'd had people breaking into their house all year, and now someone had killed her. The Strongsville Police Department came out in full force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they finally went public with who killed Melinda, no one in the community could believe it. It turns out that on October 23rd, the night Melinda was found, Jeff had been at the house with her, her son Kyle, and his own young daughter. At some point that evening, before he went to Applebee's, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen. Then he went into the kitchen where Melinda was. He walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over and over again more than 35 times. Then, when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff pulled out a gun and shot her 3 more times, just to make sure she was dead. And while he was doing this, his own daughter was just a few feet away in her playpen, and Kyle was also nearby, completely unable to understand the horror that was happening to his mother. With these 2 innocent children so close by, Jeff cleaned off his weapons. He took off his bloody clothes and hid everything inside of his car. Then he just scooped up his daughter and left the house, leaving Kyle all alone inside with his dying mother on the kitchen floor. He just left him there, shut the door, locked it, and then drove with his daughter to Applebee's to have a perfectly normal dinner with Melinda's husband and daughter. After several hours, when they got back to the house, Jeff knew exactly what was waiting for them inside. And he still let Bruce go in first to be the one to discover his own dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has never given his motive for the crime. The main theory is that Jeff was in serious financial trouble. The wedding was just a couple of days away, and he wasn't going to be able to pay for it. The wedding venue had apparently called Melinda to let her know that they were canceling the wedding because her future son-in-law couldn't afford it. And so, the theory goes, Melinda confronted Jeff about his money problems, and he just snapped and killed her. But that can't possibly be the whole story, because it would turn out that Jeff was responsible for every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovich property leading up to the murder. That means every time they saw strangers lurking in the backyard, or every time someone was trying to break into the house, it was all because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff himself outside, pretending to be a suspicious person, or he had asked his friends or even hired people to go onto the property and pretend to be stalking the family. Other times, Jeff was the only one who supposedly saw these people, and then miraculously, by the time anyone else looked, they were gone. He was lying. A childhood friend of Jeff's, who was living in the area when this all happened, said that the generally accepted reason in Strongsville for why Jeff did this was because he hated Melinda. Even though she had opened up her home to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in back in 2016, he started plotting to kill her. All of those suspicious events, all of that harassment, it was all Jeff's attempt to build this incredibly intricate alibi. He wanted to create this narrative that a group of dangerous strangers was targeting the family. That way, when he finally killed Melinda, everyone would think it was them. And at first, it worked perfectly. Everyone believed it, from the police to the family to their friends. Everyone thought that strangers had finally broken into the house and killed Melinda. There was so little suspicion on Jeff immediately after her murder that he actually served as a pallbearer at Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and the bloody clothes hidden in the back of Jeff's car. They arrested him and presented him with a mountain of evidence. And Jeff confessed to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He just said, yes, he did it. He also never offered any kind of apology or explanation to the family. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was a completely heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. He said that their son, Kyle, doesn't understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle loves to do and used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window. He just sits there, eagerly expecting his mother to show up at any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.